Perhaps the single most controversial healthcare topic in the mind of the American public is vaccines. There has been so much confusion and different thoughts about it, and it's been at the forefront of debates around American healthcare. The goal of this section is not to convince you that we should or should not take certain vaccines. That is beyond the scope of this presentation and would require a case-by-case evidence review. Rather, by the end of this section, I want you to see how the vaccine debate has gone beyond a simple academic disagreement and instead compromised the prestige of the American healthcare system. To do this, I will showcase key events that have compromised the structural integrity of the American system and how this has changed perceptions as evidenced by strong reactions both domestically and internationally. Buckle up, because here we go.
We're here to discuss a monumental national achievement. From the instant the coronavirus invaded our shores, we raced into action to develop a safe and effective vaccine at breakneck speed. We're just days away from authorization from the FDA, at which point we will immediately begin mass distribution. As a result of this unprecedented investment, we are exceedingly proud that both Pfizer and Moderna have announced that their vaccines are approximately 95% effective. Despite the grim projections from the media 8 months ago, we did something that nobody thought was possible. They said it will never happen, you could never do it, it was a pipe dream. In just a few minutes, I'll sign an executive order to ensure that American citizens have first priority to receive American vaccines. We will soon end the pandemic and we will save millions and millions of lives.
Wow, that sounds great, doesn't it? Clearly, Trump recognized the value of vaccines, declaring his public support for the COVID-19 vaccination programs and celebrating it as an achievement. Yet, the media has widely criticized his administration for adopting an increasingly anti-vaccination stance, or perhaps more accurately described as a vaccine skeptic stance. It seems that legitimate concerns have perhaps been overblown by misinterpreting or selectively reading scientific evidence. How did we get here? What changed? To understand that, you need to understand Robert F. Kennedy, and to understand Robert F. Kennedy, you need to know a little bit about what I will call the vaccine skeptic movement. Now, the development and deployment of the polio vaccine was a tremendous domestic and international success that led to an increase in American prestige. However, there's an important asterisk to that we must acknowledge. In 1955, some batches of polio vaccine given to the public contained live polio virus, even though they had passed required safety testing. Over 250 cases of polio were attributed to vaccines produced by one company, Cutter Laboratories. This became known as the Cutter incident, and it resulted in many cases of paralysis. The vaccine was recalled as soon as cases of polio were detected, and steps were taken to ensure it wouldn't happen again. Nevertheless, this incident undoubtedly left a mark in the collective psyche of Americans. Americans recognized that mistakes could happen and that the risks associated with taking vaccines should also be considered alongside any benefits. In short, there was a lingering sense of skepticism that pervaded American thought. This skepticism was fueled further when Lancet infamously published a paper in 1998 by Andrew Wakefield and colleagues, which was methodologically flawed and was eventually retracted by the journal. Wakefield was also removed from the medical register for serious professional misconduct. It's a wonder that the paper was published in the first place. The authors claimed that they asked the parents of 12 patients who were referred to hospital for chronic enterocolitis and regressive developmental disorder whether or not they thought it could be attributed to a measles, mumps, and rubella vaccine, and 8 out of 12 of them said yes. The authors concluded that possible environmental triggers, i.e. the vaccine, were associated with the onset of both gastrointestinal disease and developmental regression. The fact that this study lacked a control group, that the sample size was small, that the findings were based on the opinions of parents, that the investigators falsely altered data on the patient history, and that the so-called research was funded by lawyers preparing lawsuits against manufacturers of the vaccine was overlooked by many people in the general public who craved a simple explanation for why conditions such as autism were occurring at elevated rates. If we look at this data from the CDC, we can see that the rate of autism spectrum disorder has been increasing. In fact, from the year 2000 to the year 2022, it's increased almost 5-fold. People pointed to the fact that the rates of people with autism spectrum disorder were increasing, and they attributed this to what they thought were unsafe vaccines. Donald Trump highlighted that when he took office in January 2025, America's healthcare system recommended vaccinations for 18 diseases, which he claimed was higher than comparator countries like Japan, which recommended vaccination for 14 diseases, Germany, which recommended vaccination for 15, and Denmark, which recommended vaccination for 10. But correlation does not equal causation, and there are many other possible explanations. Another competing hypothesis is that increasing parental age can lead to autism. Shown here is the mean average age of mothers when they gave birth in the United States from 2016 to 2023. You can see that there's a steady increase in age. Now, if you're a fan of comics, you may know that every major character, whether hero or villain, has an origin story. There's usually a key moment or sequence of events that changes them from one form to another. Peter Parker changed to Spider-Man after he was bitten by a radioactive spider, and his mission in life was set when he learned that with great power comes great responsibility.
Remember, with great power comes great responsibility.
After his uncle died due to his inaction, Parker was driven to act. For Robert F. Kennedy, the pivotal moment came in 2005, when he was first approached by mothers who thought that their children had been injured by using a vaccine, including Laura Bono, Lynn Redwood, and Rita Schreffler. I want you to remember the name Lynn Redwood because I'll come back to her later. Now here's the thing. Kennedy is a lawyer, and at the time, he was busy trying to raise awareness about the dangers of mercury emissions in the water supply. The women thought that they had common cause with Kennedy and could form an alliance of sorts. They were both enemies of mercury. The Mercury Moms, as they became to be known, thought that there was mercury in vaccines that they claimed was responsible for their children's injuries, and they were determined to change health policy so that other children would not be affected in the way that their children had. Kennedy was moved by their stories, and in 2016, he joined forces with Redwood and others to launch the World Mercury Project, which would eventually become the Children's Health Defense. According to the Children's Health Defense website, the World Mercury Project's original mission was to end exposure to neurotoxic mercury in fish, medical products, dental amalgams, and vaccines, and make sound science the driver of public policy. As of January 2026, the Children's Health Defense website states that our mission is ending childhood health epidemics by eliminating toxic exposure. We will restore and protect the health of children by eliminating environmental exposures, holding responsible parties accountable, and establishing safeguards to prevent future harm of children's health, protecting children, exposing harms, seeking justice. The Children's Health Defense website goes on to say that Kennedy was struck by the chasm separating scientific reality from the consensus narrative perpetuated by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, or CDC, and other alphabet agencies, and constantly reinforced by mainstream media. He, Kennedy, quickly realized that vaccines are not subject to the same safety standards applied to other pharmaceutical products in the U.S. Food and Drug Administration approval process, and he was dismayed by the absence of large-scale, double-blind, inert, placebo-controlled studies. In short, no sound science supported the safe and effective mantra of the medical establishment. Now, a quick disclaimer here from my perspective, large-scale, double-blind, placebo-controlled studies do happen routinely when new vaccines are being developed, so this claim is verifiably false. Kennedy's superpower was he believed people and he championed for them when the conventional institutions would not, and he did so with the veneer of a trained lawyer. This was his appeal. Support for Kennedy grew at the grassroots level. Those who liked him a lot. He found that there were many other people who were compelled to blame their health conditions on vaccines and other culprits, and who blamed the administration for failure to act. Coincidentally, Robert Kennedy is the nephew of former President John F. Kennedy, who happened to be a Democrat. In 2023, Kennedy decided he would try to follow in his footsteps and run for office as a Democrat, but struggled to gain acceptance in the Democratic primary elections, perhaps because his views were seen as too fringe for mainstream support within that party. So he dropped his allegiance to the Democratic Party, declared himself as an independent, and began his election campaign. Given that Kennedy initially ran as a Democrat, it may surprise some to see that the vaccine skeptic movement has become so entrenched in the Republican psyche. The Guardian reports the opinion of Dr. David Gorski, a Wayne State University School of Medicine professor. The report says he is considered an expert on the anti-vaccine movement. He is quoted as saying, "I used to call anti-vax the pseudoscience that spanned the political spectrum. You could find left-wing anti-vaxxers, right-wing anti-vaxxers, but now it's really built into the right. You can't deny that anymore. It's become part of right-wing ideology." If Gorski is right, then how did that transition happen? In the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic, people were fed up with vaccinations and all the extra precautions in general. The Annenberg Science and Public Health Survey in October 2023 showed that there were declines in trust of vaccines. Additionally, beliefs in vaccine misinformation were on the rise. Here are some highlights from the survey. Less than 2/3 of Americans, or 63%, thought it was safer to get the COVID-19 vaccine than COVID-19 disease, a decline from 75% in April 2021. Additionally, over a quarter, or 26%, incorrectly thought ivermectin is an effective treatment for COVID-19, which was up dramatically from 10% in September of 2021. Finally, a small but growing number, 16%, believed that increased vaccines are why so many kids have autism these days, up from 10% in April 2021. Yet, although Kennedy had the support of his vocal base, they were still a minority. During the 2024 election cycle, Kennedy polled around 15% nationally. He did not have enough mainstream appeal to win an election, but his base of support was sizable enough that it could sway an election. Shortly after the failed assassination attempt on his life in July 2024, Trump reached out to Kennedy and tried to persuade him to join his team. A phone call was leaked by Kennedy's son on his X account. The clip was later deleted from the account, but it can still be found online.
Really, you man, something's wrong with that whole system. Yeah. And it's a doctor issue, Frank. Remember I said I want to do small doses. Small doses. When you feed a baby, Bobby, a vaccination that has like 38 different vaccines, and it looks like it's meant for a horse, not a 10-pound or 20-pound baby. It looks like you should be giving on a horse this. And do you ever see the size of it, right? It's just massive. And then you see the baby all of a sudden starting to change radically. I've seen it too many times. And then you hear that it doesn't have an impact, right? But you and I talked about that a long time ago. And anyway, I would love you to do something. And I think it'll be so good for you and so big for you. And we're going to win. We're going to win. We're way ahead of the guy.
Although it's a bit hard to hear what was being said, Trump basically tried to win Kennedy over by echoing Kennedy's skepticism about vaccines and telling Kennedy that he would love him to do something about it. Kennedy, at this point realizing that he wasn't likely to win on his own, decided that if he wanted to have any chance at implementing the vaccine changes that he wanted, he would need to join Trump's team. Kennedy then ended his push as an independent and endorsed Trump, making it easier for Trump to win in key swing states. In return, rewarding Kennedy for his act of loyalty and subordination, Trump appointed Kennedy as the director of the Department of Health and Human Services so that he could begin making the changes that he wanted to make. Trump recognized that appointing Kennedy was controversial, and he sought to reassure the broader public who did support widespread vaccine use that he also supported vaccines more broadly. He wanted to clarify that although Robert Kennedy could change how vaccinations are being approached in America, this would be done according to a measured and rational approach.
Something bad's happening. Again, you take a look at autism today versus 20, 25 years ago, it's like not even believable. So we're going to have reports. No, nothing's going to happen very quickly. I think you're going to find that Bobby he's a very rational guy. I found him to be very rational. No, nothing, you're not going to lose the polio vaccine. That's not going to happen. I saw what happened with the polio. I have friends that were very much affected by that. I have friends from many years ago, and they have, obviously, they're still in not such good shape because of it. And many people died. And the moment they took that vaccine, it ended. Dr. Jonas Salk did a great job. So I don't anticipate that at all. But we're going to look into finding why is the autism rate so much higher than it was 20, 25, 30 years ago. I mean, it's 100 times higher. There's something wrong, and we're going to try finding that.
The implication was he wasn't going to give Kennedy a free pass to change whatever he wanted, but he hinted that there might be a link between vaccines and autism and that they should investigate it. On numerous occasions, Robert Kennedy also tried to comfort the public by asserting that he would not take away vaccines from Americans, but he planned to change which vaccines were endorsed for routine use. He would also come to redirect funding for research to the type of research that he found to be most suitable. Donald Trump knew that changes were coming, and he needed to frame these changes in a way that the public would accept them. He likely expected that Kennedy would reduce the number of recommended vaccines and anticipated that people who felt that the vaccines were protecting them would react with outrage to having the recommendations removed. He needed to convey to the public that the changes that were being made under Kennedy's leadership were evidence-based to reduce the likelihood that it would blow back on him. He settled on the catchphrase "gold standard science," a phrase that he and those in his administration would repeat when necessary to sell their ideas to the public and which they would fall back on when their credibility was challenged. Here's some wording from a presidential action by Trump in May of 2025. A majority of researchers in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics believe science is facing a reproducibility crisis. The falsification of data by leading researchers has led to high-profile retractions of federally funded research. Unfortunately, the federal government has contributed to this loss of trust. In several notable cases, executive departments and agencies have used or promoted scientific information in a highly misleading manner. My administration is committed to restoring a gold standard for science to ensure that federally funded research is transparent, rigorous, and impactful, and that federal decisions are informed by the most credible, reliable, and impartial scientific evidence available.
I love gold!
We must restore the American people's faith in the scientific enterprise and institutions that create and apply scientific knowledge in service of the public good. Reproducibility, rigor, and unbiased peer review must be maintained. This order restores the scientific integrity policies of my first administration and ensures that agencies practice data transparency, acknowledge relevant scientific uncertainties, are transparent about the assumptions and likelihood of scenarios used, approach scientific findings objectively, and communicate scientific data accurately. Agency use of gold standard science, as set forth in this order, will spur innovation, translate discovery to success, and ensure continued American strength and global leadership in technology. Now, those are strong criticisms of the previous administration. However, I have no opposition to the wording about the gold standard science. In general, it sounds scientifically rigorous, impartial, and, to put it bluntly, like he endorses good science. But how did that play out in practice? To make this easier to understand, you'll need to have some context. So I'll first give a brief overview of the vaccine life cycle and the role of the Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices, or ACIP, which sits at a critical juncture within it. Following clinical trial testing, it is sent to the FDA to review the safety and efficacy of the vaccine. The FDA will evaluate the balance of safety and efficacy, and if they determine that the benefits outweigh the risks, then the vaccine will be approved for marketing. However, just because it can be used doesn't mean it should be used. Deciding whether or not a vaccine should be used requires a broader understanding of the environment in which it will be used, including what other treatments are available and how the public is likely to react. That's where ACIP comes in. Take a listen to this government video explaining ACIP.
The Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices, or ACIP, may be unfamiliar to many Americans. Yet its role in protecting and improving the nation's health is critical. The committee and its work have been a part of our lives, protecting our health since the mid-20th century. For more than 50 years, the committee has advised the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, also known as the CDC, on vaccination recommendations for all Americans, including who should get which vaccine and when, as well as precautions and contraindications to vaccination. Its recommendations are reviewed and adopted by CDC as standards of care for clinicians across the country. It's important to note committee members must declare any conflicts of interest and recuse themselves from discussions or votes if their conflicts are considered a concern. ACIP reviews the rigorous studies conducted by vaccine manufacturers to ensure that a vaccine is safe and effective at specific ages. Committee members evaluate the severity of the disease and the vaccine's effectiveness in addressing the burden of disease. Community impacts and reactions are also considered, as is the impact on health equity. Discussions and deliberations occur during ACIP meetings, which are open to the public. The meetings also offer a public comment period for community input to be shared before a final decision is made. These actions provide transparency around the committee's decisions and judgments.
Lee, yes.
McNally, yes.
If there is enough information to move forward with a vaccine recommendation, a quorum is required for the committee to act. Once the ACIP makes a recommendation, the CDC director will approve, amend, or reject the recommendation. If approved, the recommendation is published in CDC's Morbidity and Mortality Weekly Report, and upon publication, represents the official recommendation in the United States. Understanding the process and importance of ACIP recommendations help healthcare professionals feel confident that the vaccines they recommend to their patients are safe and effective.
On May 27, Kennedy made an announcement through social media, X, that he was removing the recommendation to vaccinate healthy children and healthy pregnant women with the COVID vaccine. This was controversial because it bypassed ACIP. The decision was not supported by the presentation of any data, and it was delivered through social media, not through official CDC channels.
Hi, everybody. I'm Robert F. Kennedy Jr., your HHS Secretary, and I'm here today with NIH Director Dr. Jay Bhattacharya and FDA Commissioner Dr. Marty Makary. I couldn't be more pleased to announce that as of today, the COVID vaccine for healthy children and healthy pregnant women has been removed from the CDC recommended immunization schedule. Last year, the Biden administration urged healthy children to get yet another COVID shot despite the lack of any clinical data to support the repeat booster strategy in children.
That ends today. It's common sense and it's good science.
There's no evidence healthy kids need it today, and most countries have stopped recommending it for children.
We're now one step closer to realizing President Trump's promise to make America healthy again.
Produced by the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services.
The claim itself was also misleading. For example, at the time he made the announcement, there was already a peer-reviewed clinical trial evaluating booster doses in children aged 6 to 11 years, finding that the booster had a favorable safety profile with no new safety concerns and that it met non-inferiority criteria compared to young adults. A more accurate statement would have been, pediatric booster data is more limited than adult data, but available clinical evidence supports safety and immunogenicity. The claim that the decision to remove the recommendation is good science and common sense sounds empty when no scientific papers or data were used to explain the decision. The reaction in the medical community was immediate and scathing. The American Academy of Pediatrics was quick to condemn the disregard for the normal process and the potential risk this could cause to patients. Notably, the American Academy of Pediatrics is a private nonprofit professional association representing approximately 67,000 pediatricians. It is not a government agency, and it is funded through membership dues, publications, grants, and donations. While I have my doubts, it's possible that Kennedy could be justified for removing the recommendation, but the problem is he skipped the step where people were supposed to debate the merits of keeping or removing the vaccine recommendation. That's kind of important if you want to uphold the so-called gold standard science with objectivity and transparency. Rather, the decision was taken unilaterally from the top down without regard for the thoughts and scientific advice of the committee members who normally advise on these issues. Now, in the video I showed you, Kennedy was flanked by the head of the FDA and the NIH. Noticeably absent was the head of the CDC, as the agency was in a transition period. The last director, Mandy Cohen, left her position when the Trump administration came to office, and a new director of the CDC had not yet been appointed by Kennedy. The members of ACIP must have been dismayed that they were bypassed, to put it mildly. While it's hard to know exactly what conversations may have transpired behind closed doors over the days that followed, what we do know is that 3 days after Kennedy's announcement on May 30th, 2025, Dr. Lakshmi Panagiotakopoulos, a lead on the CDC COVID-19 Vaccine Advisory Group, resigned in protest. In her resignation email, she wrote, My career in public health and vaccinology started with a deep-seated desire to help the most vulnerable members of our population, and that is not something I am able to continue doing in this role. This was just the thunder before the storm, because on June 9, Kennedy made another announcement, this time in an op-ed article in the Wall Street Journal, that all 17 members of the ACIP committee would be fired. I suspect that the members of ACIP had protested against Kennedy's decision to bypass them, and he presumably decided that the most straightforward path for him to advance his agenda was to simply dismiss all of them. Somewhat ironically, he sold his decision to the public as a way to restore trust in the administration. Here are some key statements from his op-ed article. Vaccines have become a divisive issue in American politics, but there is one thing all parties can agree on. The U.S. faces a crisis of public trust. Whether toward health agencies, pharmaceutical companies, or vaccines themselves, public confidence is waning. ACIP evaluates the efficacy, safety, and clinical need of the nation's vaccines and passes its findings on to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. The committee has been plagued with persistent conflicts of interest and has become little more than a rubber stamp for any vaccine. A clean sweep is needed to reestablish public confidence in vaccine science. In the 1960s, the world sought guidance from America's health regulators, who had a reputation for integrity, scientific impartiality, and zealous defense of patient welfare. Public trust has since collapsed, but we will earn it back. The American Medical Association reacted immediately and released a statement on June 9, 2025. It said, "For generations, the Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices, or ACIP, has been a trusted national source of science and data-driven advice and guidance on the use of vaccines to prevent and control disease. Physicians, parents, community leaders, and public health officials rely on them for clinical guidance, public health information, and knowledge. Today's action to remove the 17 sitting members of ACIP undermines that trust and upends a transparent process that has saved countless lives. With an ongoing measles outbreak and routine child vaccination rates declining, this move will further fuel the spread of vaccine-preventable illnesses." I'd like to highlight this viewpoint from Dr. Isaac Bogosh, which I think provides some perspective on how this is being viewed by the healthcare community outside of the United States.
What could change, and what are the concerns that this raises for you?
Well, there's a couple of things. Number one is that it has the potential to significantly erode trust in the United States, and you see a greater resurgence of vaccine preventable illnesses because perhaps people aren't going to be using products that have already been deemed through decades and decades of data to be very effective and with a well-established safety profile. So that's number one. Number two is that nothing happens in a vacuum. We're obviously well into the information or maybe even misinformation era, unfortunately, and nothing happens in a vacuum. So people look at the United States as well from all over the world, and some of the sentiment, positive and negative, regardless, is going to bleed over into other places. In a case like this, it's not clear what the process is going to be. There's certainly the potential for mistrust and negative consequences elsewhere on the planet. But the third thing, I think importantly, is with issues like this come great opportunities. And this is an opportunity for Canada to lead. We already have a sound, independent, data-driven vaccine advisory group. We have NACI. They do a remarkable job. And Canada can be the global leader on this front. And we can certainly elevate the status of NACI and showcase NACI to the rest of the world and say, hey, you know what? We have the expertise here in Canada. We are doing this. We are independent, a non-governmental group that advises government. Here's our website. Here's our processes. And again, it's all very clear for the general public to see around the world. They have a updated webpage with summaries and then nuanced advice. And we can certainly showcase Canadian talent to the rest of the world and be a global leader on this front.
The key point here is that the failure in trust is leading to a loss in prestige. Americans are leaving a gap in the leadership of healthcare policy that other countries could fill. America's loss could be Canada's opportunity, or opportunity for other like-minded countries where politics does not seem to be polarizing healthcare policy. 2 days after the firings occurred, on June 11th, 2025, Kennedy announced on social media that he was replacing the ACIP members with his own hand-picked committee that would uphold the gold standard science. He then gave a brief biography of each of these members. Some of the people he appointed to the ACIP panel were well-known vaccine skeptics, and others were not known to have any prominent anti-vaccine views. Defenders of Kennedy could point out that he was bringing to the panel a diverse range of opinions, while critics could argue that he was introducing people to the panel who had no business being there due to their fringe pseudoscientific views. In some ways, the panel was reformed not necessarily to reflect the leading scientific expertise, but rather a broader set of viewpoints that reflected public opinion, which included anti-vaccine sentiment. This was populism in action. The vaccine skeptics, who had been marginalized by the institutions for decades, they now felt vindicated. To the public, they now had an air of legitimacy, backed by the authority of the U.S. healthcare institutions. Three well-known vaccine skeptics who were added to ACIP were Robert W. Malone, Vicki Pebsworth, and Retsef Levy. Robert Malone has made anti-mRNA claims related to the COVID vaccine and spread misinformation about measles deaths. Vicki Pebsworth is a longtime board member of the National Vaccine Information Center and is known for spreading misinformation about vaccine safety and opposing vaccines. The National Vaccine Information Center started in 1982 as the Virginia as Dissatisfied Parents Together, before the name was changed to the National Vaccine Information Center to make it sound more credible. Like the Mercury moms, Pebsworth believes that her son was severely injured by vaccines and attributed his autism to taking the MMR vaccine. Retsef Levy has opposed mRNA vaccines, citing safety concerns. Besides the ACIP panel, Kennedy has also made some other controversial hirings. Notably, he hired Lynn Redwood to the CDC's Immunization Safety Office. Recall that Lynn Redwood was one of the original Mercury moms that approached Kennedy back in 2005 and convinced him to take up the fight against mercury in vaccines. Lynn is a nurse who has also been acting president of the Children's Health Defense, the organization that was set up by Kennedy. The decision to hire Lynn Redwood foreshadowed even more challenges for the administration, a point which I'll come back to shortly. Kennedy also hired David Greer to lead an investigation on the link between vaccines and autism. Greer does not have a medical degree and was once disciplined by the Maryland State Board of Physicians for practicing medicine without a license. He has long been criticized for saying there's an association between vaccines and autism, even though mainstream science has repeatedly refuted this. From June 25 to 26, the first ACIP meeting with Kennedy's hand-picked advisors convened. There were several topics on the agenda which spanned the two-day meeting. One of the topics was whether or not thimerosal should be banned from influenza vaccines. Kennedy had pushed this thimerosal topic onto the agenda and invited Lynn Redwood to give a presentation on it. Recall that Redwood was one of the Mercury moms that had originally motivated Kennedy to begin his crusade against vaccines that included mercury-based compounds. Here's a short snippet of her summarizing her presentation.
In summary, mercury is the third most toxic element on Earth, only behind polonium and plutonium, and it has no physiological role in the human body. Thimerosal was grandfathered for use without adequate safety testing by the FDA, and it's not generally recognized as being safe or effective by the FDA over-the-counter division since 1998. There's also evidence that thimerosal is not an effective preservative at vaccine levels, and that thimerosal can cross the placenta and blood-brain barriers and converts to inorganic mercury in the brain at higher levels than methylmercury. Studies have identified infants with blood levels after exposure to thimerosal-containing vaccines that breach CDC guidelines for a case of mercury toxicity, mercury chemical poisoning. Next slide, please. Thimerosal is recognized as a developmental and reproductive toxicant and is listed as a chemical on the California Proposition 65 list since 1990. Unused doses of thimerosal preserved flu shots must be disposed of as a hazardous waste. And tremendous progress has been made in removing thimerosal, but from data that I recently received, more than 60,000 pregnant women received thimerosal-containing flu vaccines through Medicaid and the 2019-2020 flu season. We currently have enough thimerosal-free vaccines to recommend that all pregnant women, infants, and children receive only thimerosal-free vaccines. After a critical appraisal of this issue almost 25 years ago, the prestigious Institute of Medicine made this same recommendation. Removing a known neurotoxin from being injected into our most vulnerable population is a good place to start with making America healthy again. Thank you.
Thimerosal is a mercury-based preservative that had been phased out of most vaccines in the United States, but it was still being used in some multi-dose vials for the influenza vaccine. It may be added to vaccines to prevent serious infections, which may result from bacterial or fungal contamination of the vaccine. For decades, vaccine skeptics had tried to link thimerosal to neurodevelopmental problems, a claim that has been consistently refuted by mainstream scientists. In the body, thimerosal is rapidly broken down to ethylmercury, which is rapidly excreted in the stool. Ethylmercury is different from methylmercury, which enters the body primarily through the consumption of contaminated fish, and is different from phenylmercury, which is used as a fungicide in agriculture. These forms of mercury build up in the body and are not cleared as effectively as ethylmercury. Methylmercury and phenylmercury have been shown to cause neurotoxicity as they cross the blood-brain barrier and the placenta. Ethylmercury has been shown to do neither of these. Just because something has mercury in it does not automatically make it toxic. To put this in perspective, both water and alcohol contain oxygen and hydrogen. Drinking water and drinking alcohol will result in very different effects on the body. Research-based articles have identified no causal link between thimerosal and autism or other developmental disorders. However, some members of the public continue to question this link. So whether the risk is real or perceived to be real, it has the same impact. The CDC had prepared a document arguing that thimerosal was safe, but this was not presented at the meeting. ACIP members were asked why, and they seemed unsure of how to answer that question, but they said that they had been provided with the document separately to read on their own.
And Arthur Phyllis.
Thank you, Dr. Kildorf. Just two quick, one question and a request. Thank you, Ms. Redwood, for the presentation. I wondered if you could share the source of the 60,000 Medicaid patients, just for our information. And then secondly, there was a document on the website initially that was a CDC document on the thimerosal issue. I wondered if that could be reposted as well to accompany Ms. Redwood's presentation. Thank you.
This is Dr. Malone. My understanding is that article was not authorized by the Office of the Secretary and has been removed consequent. I'm sure that the Office of the Secretary will make note of your comment and direct the CDC as necessary. Over.
And all of us members on the committee has received that, so we have all read it. So in the committee we all know about that thing. So
the decision not to present the data alongside Lynn's criticism of thimerosal undermines the value of the CDC's scientific expertise and contradicts any argument that Kennedy was aiming to achieve a fair and balanced view, weighing pro and anti-thimerosal perspectives. Only anti-thimerosal perspectives were formally presented prior to a vote on whether or not it should be removed from the influenza vaccines.
Hi, I'm Robert F. Kennedy Jr., and I send my greetings to all the distinguished delegates at the Mid-Atlantic Convention. I had hoped to be with you today, but the government shutdown means that I couldn't do that. The Mid-Atlantic Convention was born from a shared moral conviction that no human being should suffer from exposure to mercury. You came together to protect future generations from this potent neurotoxin, and I'm looking forward to continued progress. Article 4 of the convention calls on parties to cut mercury use by phasing out listed mercury-added products. But in 2010, as the treaty took shape, negotiators made a major exception. Thimerosal-containing vaccines were carved out of the regulation. The same treaty that began to phase out mercury in lamps and cosmetics chose to leave it in products injected into babies, pregnant women, and the most vulnerable among us. We have to ask why. Why do we hold a double standard for mercury? Why do we call it dangerous in batteries, in over-the-counter medications and makeup, but acceptable in vaccines and dental fillings? Thimerosal is a mercury-based preservative that has never undergone proper safety testing in humans. Hundreds of peer-reviewed studies identify it as a potent neurotoxin, a mutagen, a carcinogen, and an endocrine disruptor. Thimerosal's own label requires it to be treated as hazardous material and warns against ingestion. There is not a single study that proves it's safe. That's why in July of this year, the United States closed the final chapter on the use of thimerosal as a vaccine preservative, something that should have happened years ago. I want to be clear. It's inexcusable that governments around the world still allow mercury-based compounds in healthcare when safe alternatives exist. Now that America has removed mercury from all vaccines, I call on every global health authority and every party to this convention to do the same. Manufacturers have confirmed that they can produce mercury-free, single-dose vaccines without interrupting supply. There is no excuse for inaction or holding stubbornly to the status quo. Let's honor and protect humanity and our children and creation from mercury, and let's act in the true spirit of the Minamata Convention for the integrity of this historic treaty and to ensure that no child anywhere in the world is ever exposed to this deadly neurotoxin again. Thank you.
Research-based articles have identified no causal link between thimerosal and autism or other developmental disorders. However, some members of the public continue to question this link. So, whether or not the risk is real or perceived to be real, it has the same impact. Since alternatives to thimerosal are available, using those alternatives may remove the excuse for not taking the vaccine. Personally, I have no opposition to removing it from vaccines if it reassures the general public, but my criticism lies in the unscientific process that was used to ram this decision into official policy. On July 31st, 2025, after performing his clean sweep of the ACIP, he selected a new director for the CDC, Susan Menares.
Hi, I'm Robert F. Kennedy Jr., your HHS Secretary, and I'm here with Dr. Susan Menares, who is our new CDC Director. She's the first director in American history who has been confirmed by the Senate. Dr. Susan Menares, would you put your left hand on the Bible, raise your right hand. I'm very happy to have Dr. Menares aboard. She comes to us from ARPA-H. She's a tech genius, and she's going to drive AI and modernize CDC's data systems. And we're going to be able to provide first-class information, gold standard science to the American people.
I take this obligation freely.
Susan is an expert in public health, and I'm confident that she will do everything that she can to restore the integrity of this agency.
The duties of the office. Thank you, sir. I am truly honored and humbled. Thank you so much for your support over the past several months. I am so honored with the privilege of heading up CDC. It's such an important institution, and I look forward to supporting you over the next several years as we continue to make America healthier again.
So help me God.
So help me God.
Thank you very much, and welcome aboard.
Thank you, sir.
Produced by the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services.
It seemed like love at first sight, but it was not to last. Menares' tenure was short and brutal. Now let's pause for a moment. I want to show you something. Here are two Nobel Prize winners, Katalin Karikó and Drew Weissman, receiving their award for developing the mRNA technology needed to create the first COVID mRNA vaccines.
DNA is the genetic blueprint that defines what we are. A fish, a honeybee, a lemon tree, or a human. RNA is less well known, but equally important. Messenger RNA, or mRNA, carries genetic information and acts as a template for protein production. Thousands of different mRNA molecules are present in each of our cells at any given time, instructing the cells how to develop and what functions to execute. Conversion of DNA to mRNA to protein is an evolutionary conserved process that is common to all forms of life. Messenger RNA was first defined by Jacob and Monod in 1961, a discovery that was awarded with the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine in 1965. Although the identity and function of mRNA has been known for over 60 years, and mRNA is routinely used in most modern medical research laboratories, the term has remained largely obscure outside the scientific community. Until recently. This year's Nobel Prize laureates in Physiology or Medicine, Professor Katalin Karikó and Professor Drew Weissman, have ensured that the term mRNA is now broadly recognized. Most of us present here today have received one or several mRNA vaccine doses in our arm, a process that directs some of our cells to produce the encoded protein for a short while. If the mRNA encodes a foreign virus protein, such as in the case of the COVID vaccines, this will alert our immune system to stimulate a response against the virus, protecting us against disease should we later become infected. RNA molecules are elegantly simple in their composition, with just 4 building blocks, nucleotides, linked together in different order to encode any protein of interest. Katalin Karikó, an expert mRNA biochemist, and Drew Weissman, a skilled immunologist, shared a vision of using mRNA as a generic carrier of information for clinical applications. But early results showed limited success. Karikó and Weissman realized that to achieve their goal, they needed to understand how our cells respond to different forms of RNA at the molecular level. In a breakthrough discovery published in 2005, they demonstrated that mRNA produced with standard nucleotides evoked an undesired inflammatory response in our cells. They found that this reaction was circumvented when one of the 4 nucleotides was chemically modified to mimic our own mRNA. This finding provided a solution to a major problem previously facing all mRNA-based clinical applications, propelling the mRNA technology into a whole new era. The discovery by this year's Nobel Prize laureates in physiology or medicine surprisingly enabled the development of effective vaccines that helped control a devastating pandemic and save millions of lives 15 years later. In 2020, the scientific community, together with governments, the private sector, and regulatory authorities, demonstrated that it's possible to greatly reduce the time needed for vaccine development in situations where this is urgently needed. This year's prize is very much in the spirit of Alfred Nobel, a groundbreaking contribution to the greatest benefit of humankind. Dear Professors Karikó and Weissman, on behalf of the Nobel Assembly at Karolinska Institutet, it's my great joy and privilege to convey to you our warmest congratulations. I invite you now to step forward to receive the Nobel Prize from the hands of His Majesty the King.
Speech by Professor Gunilla Carlsson Hederstam. And first to receive the Medicine Prize is Katalin Karikó, born in Hungary, affiliated to the Szeged University in Hungary and the University of Pennsylvania in the United States. Weissman, American, working at the Penn Institute for RNA Innovations and the University of Pennsylvania.
This was America at its best. They worked at the University of Pennsylvania and were funded by grants from the National Institutes of Health. In a single year, from 2021 to 2022, it has been estimated that the COVID-19 vaccinations prevented 14.4 million deaths globally. The technology they developed has potential applications not just for COVID-19, but for many other diseases as well.
I didn't celebrate when the phase 3 clinical trials came in. I had already moved on to something new. We were working on pan-coronavirus vaccines, sickle cell anemia gene therapy, malaria with people across the US and in Africa, leptospirosis with people in Southeast Asia, vaccines for peanut allergies. We're working on really every imaginable infectious disease.
On August 5th, 2025, Kennedy announced that he's ending $500 million in mRNA vaccine research.
Hi, it's Robert F. Kennedy Jr. here, your HHS secretary. At HHS, we have a division called the Biomedical Advanced Research and Development Authority, or BARDA. BARDA drives some of our most advanced scientific research. It funds developments of vaccines, drugs, diagnostics, and other tools to fight emerging diseases and national health threats. Over the past few weeks, BARDA reviewed 22 mRNA vaccine development investments and began canceling them. Let me explain why. Most of these shots are for flu or COVID, but as the pandemic showed us, mRNA vaccines don't perform well against viruses that infect the upper respiratory tract. Here's the problem. mRNA only codes for a small part of the viral proteins, usually a single antigen. One mutation and the vaccine becomes ineffective. This dynamic drives a phenomenon called antigenic shift, meaning that the vaccine paradoxically encourages new mutations and can actually prolong pandemics as the virus constantly mutates to escape the protective effects of the vaccine. Millions of people, maybe even you or someone you know, caught the Omicron variant despite being vaccinated. That's because a single mutation can make mRNA vaccines ineffective. The same risk applies to flu. After reviewing the science and consulting top experts at NIH and FDA, HHS has determined that mRNA technology poses more risks than benefits for these respiratory viruses. That's why, after extensive review, BARDA has begun the process of terminating these 22 contracts totaling just under $500 million. To replace the troubled mRNA programs, we're prioritizing the development of safer, broader vaccine strategies, like whole virus vaccines and novel platforms that don't collapse when viruses mutate. Let me be absolutely clear. HHS supports safe, effective vaccines for every American who wants them. That's why we're moving beyond the limitations of mRNA for respiratory viruses and investing in better solutions. Thank you.
Kennedy said that he's terminating these programs because data show these vaccines fail to protect effectively against upper respiratory infections like COVID and flu, but he did not offer any scientific evidence to support that claim. If the climate in the American healthcare ecosystem was already tense, on August 8th, a match would be set to the kindling. Gunman Patrick Joseph White attacked the CDC, and by the end of the attack, both he and a police officer lay dead.
According to the Georgia Bureau of Investigation, they say that White fired over 500 rounds, 200 of which striking over 6 different CDC buildings. Now, we're also being told that the rounds fired by police did not hit the suspect. Now, investigators, they recovered a total of 5 firearms that belonged to White, as well as several other pieces of evidence. And we also know that over 150 windows across those 6 buildings have been destroyed, bullets even penetrating some blast-resistant glass, narrowly missing employees who were sheltering in place in their offices. Now, we do know that no CDC staff or employees were injured. We do know that DeKalb County police officer David Rose was killed responding to this shooting. White was later found dead at that CVS from a self-inflicted gunshot wound.
And police say that documents also showed the shooter had suicidal thoughts and was unhappy about the COVID vaccine. What more are you hearing about that?
Yeah, that's right. So we're essentially starting to learn more information about his motive. Now, first things first, we do know that his father was in contact with the police right after this shooting, and we know that from a 911 call that was obtained by our affiliate, WSB. Now, they're saying that the father contacted police shortly after the shooting and that he was concerned his son may have been responsible. Now, according to that incident report, White's father told police he hadn't seen or heard from his son since the night before, and his father also told police that his son essentially left him what looked like a suicide note. Now, law enforcement and CDC officials, they say that White's deadly attack on the CDC was fueled by his deeply held beliefs in misinformation. They say that he targeted the CDC because he believed the COVID-19 vaccine made him sick and that the agency actually tried to cover it up. Now, he suffered from depression and suicidal thoughts, which he attributed to the vaccination, according to investigators. We do know that there were no previous threats to the CDC, although White had sought mental health assistance the weeks prior to the attack, Diane.
All right, Ikejachi, thank you.
White believed that his depression and suicidal thoughts were a direct result of the COVID-19 vaccine, which are both mRNA vaccines. So far, there has not been a clear and consistent safety signal linking COVID-19 to depression or suicidal ideation. We might wonder if he had been influenced by the recent announcement that funding for mRNA research was to be halted. In the wake of the shooting, Menarez called for a restoration of trust in CDC, which included the need to combat misinformation. In the case of Patrick Joseph White, misinformation had led to deadly consequences, which could be plausibly attributed to the anti-vaccine rhetoric that had seeped into American healthcare policy. The shooting sparked an outcry from federal workers, including the CDC, and they emphasized that the violent attack was not random in a pointed letter targeted to the administration. In the letter, they had 3 demands. Number 1, stop spreading inaccurate health information. Number 2, affirm the CDC's scientific integrity. And number 3, guarantee the safety of the workforce. Although the letter was strongly worded, it was a plea for change. It did not call for Kennedy's resignation. They wanted Kennedy to take a course correction. Despite the calls for Kennedy to provide a clear and unequivocal stance in condemning vaccine disinformation, it never came. Then this happened. On August 27th, Kennedy announced that Menares had been dismissed from her position. To put it bluntly, he fired her. In protest of the direction the agency was going, within hours of Menares' dismissal, Deb Oury, Demeter Daskalakis, and Daniel Jernigan, 3 prominent CDC directors, resigned. On August 27th, Dr. Demeter shared his resignation letter on his social media account. He writes, "This decision has not come easily, as I deeply value the work that the CDC does in safeguarding public health and am proud of my contributions to that critical mission. However, after much contemplation and reflection on recent developments and perspectives brought to light by Secretary Robert F. Kennedy Jr., I find that the views he and his staff have shared challenge my ability to continue in my current role at the agency and in the service of the health of the American people. Enough is enough. While I hold immense respect for the institution and my colleagues, I believe that it is imperative to align my professional responsibilities to my system of ethics and my understanding of the science of infectious disease, immunology, and my promise to serve the American people. This step is necessary to ensure that I can contribute effectively in a capacity that allows me to remain true to my principles. It is untenable to serve in an organization that is not afforded the opportunity to discuss decisions of scientific and public health importance released under the moniker of CDC. The lack of communication by HHS and other CDC political leadership that culminates in social media posts announcing major policy changes without prior notice demonstrate a disregard of normal communication channels and common sense. Having to retrofit analyses and policy actions to match inadequately thought out announcements in poorly scripted videos or page-long X posts should not be how organizations responsible for the health of people should function. Some examples include the announcement of the change in COVID-19 recommendations for children and pregnant people, the firing of scientists from ACIP by X post, and an op-ed rather than direct communication with these valuable experts, the announcement of new ACIP members by X before onboarding and vetting have completed, and the release of term of reference for an ACIP workgroup that ignored all feedback from career staff at CDC. He also writes, "I am resigning because of the cowardice of a leader that cannot admit that his and his minions' words over decades created an environment where violence like this can occur. I reject his and his colleagues' thoughts and prayers and advise they direct those to people that they have not actively harmed." The dismissal of Susan Menares further stoked the fires. The Wall Street Journal reports that more than 1,000 current and former Health and Human Services employees called on Kennedy to resign in a letter to the Secretary and members of Congress. The letter said the Secretary's actions threaten the nation's health, citing his involvement in former CDC Director Susan Menares' dismissal and appointment of vaccine skeptics to the Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices, among other reasons. Unlike the previous letter, which had simply called for Kennedy to change his actions, this letter specifically demanded his resignation. They didn't think Kennedy could change his ways anymore and thought the only recourse was his resignation. The fire continued to spread. On September the 4th, Menares wrote an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal. In it, she wrote, "Investigators found documents in which the gunman expressed his discontent with COVID vaccines, indicating his actions were driven by vaccine distrust. Amid the trauma, hundreds of CDC employees told me the same thing. We need to take immediate steps to rebuild public trust. Just as we began to recover, I was confronted with another challenge, pressure to compromise science itself. Reporters have focused on the August 25th meeting with my boss, Health and Human Services Secretary Robert F. Kennedy, in which he pressured me to resign or face termination. One of the troubling directives from that meeting, more than a week ago, I was told to pre-approve the recommendations of a vaccine advisory panel newly filled with people who have publicly expressed anti-vaccine rhetoric. That panel's next meeting is scheduled for September 18 to 19. It is imperative that the panel's recommendations aren't rubber-stamped, but instead are rigorously and scientifically reviewed before being accepted or rejected. Since August the 25th, I've had serious concerns. Those seeking to undermine vaccines use a familiar playbook, discredit research, weaken advisory committees, and use manipulated outcomes to unravel protections that generations of families had relied on to keep deadly diseases at bay. Once trusted experts are removed and advisory bodies are stacked, the results are predetermined. That isn't reform, it's sabotage. Public health shouldn't be partisan. The same day that Menares' Wall Street Journal op-ed came out, there was a hearing for Kennedy. The Senate had decided they needed to get involved. In the hearing, both Democrat and Republican senators grilled Kennedy, demanding that he explain himself. To give you a sense of the tone of the meeting, here's one clip.
We are the sickest country in the world. That's why we have to fire people at the CDC. They did not do their job.
So Kennedy blames the CDC for the current health status of the people in the United States. However, I think it's important to note that the health outcomes are multifactorial and can be influenced by a lot of things, some of which go beyond the CDC's control.
And Mr. Chairman, I'd like to put in the record today an op-ed written by Susan Menares, who was fired by Mr. Kennedy.
Without objection.
So what we know, and Dr. Menares, was approved by Republicans. She wrote an op-ed today in the Wall Street Journal, which I've just put in the record, and I quote her. She said, "I was told to pre-approve the recommendations of a vaccine advisory panel newly filled with people who have publicly expressed anti-vaccine rhetoric." So this is not some liberal philosopher or something. This is the CDC director who tells the Wall Street Journal, which is not exactly interested in progressive, theories and the like, that she was told to pre-approve the recommendations of a vaccine advisory panel filled with people who publicly expressed anti-vaccine rhetoric. So my first question, Mr. Secretary, is did you, in fact, do what Director Menares said you did, which is tell her to just go along with vaccine recommendations, even if she didn't think such recommendations aligned with scientific evidence?
No, I did not.
That's a yes or no. So you have an opportunity to call her a liar if you say that you didn't do it, but I'd like to see you respond to this.
No, I did not say that to her. And I never had a private meeting with her. So there are witnesses to every meeting that we have, and all those witnesses will say, I never said that.
So she's lying today to the American people in the Wall Street Journal?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Let's talk now about what's coming up, because I've made it clear what I've thought about the 203 days with my colleague, Senator Also Brooks. In 2 weeks, CDC's Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices will meet to make decisions about critical vaccines that protect us against hepatitis B, measles, and more. The committee's got a profound impact on vaccine access, but these aren't ordinary meetings. You stack the deck to ensure the panel bends to your views. In June, you fired all 17 committee members who were respected scientists and doctors. You replaced them with non-experts, vaccine skeptics, and conspiracy theorists. As a result, this critical advisory panel has lost scientific credibility. After years, colleagues, we spent so much time not looking at this as Democrats and Republicans, but as good science and scientific credibility. And now the American Academy of Pediatrics has warned that the committee is being politicized at the expense of children's health. American Academy of Pediatrics, you think they're lying too?
I think the American Academy of Pediatrics is gravely conflicted. Their biggest contributors are the 4 largest vaccine makers. They run a journal, Pediatrics, which they make a lot of money on, that is completely dependent on pharmaceutical companies. So I wouldn't put a big stake in what they say that benefits pharmaceutical interests. Senator, I didn't politicize ACIP. I depoliticized it. The Congress has been investigating ACIP.
All over the country, Mr. Secretary, scientists and doctors are saying otherwise. They're all wrong, too. They're all lying, according to you.
The scientists and doctors are supporting me all over the country. There is division on opinion.
That sure doesn't sound like just difference of opinion to me. Not long after Kennedy's hearing, on September 17th, Menares had a hearing of her own. She was joined by Dr. Howery, who also testified. Here are some key moments from Menares' opening remarks.
On the morning of August 25th, Secretary Kennedy demanded 2 things of me that were inconsistent with my oath of office and the ethics required of a public official. He directed me to commit in advance to approving every ACIP recommendation, regardless of the scientific evidence. He also directed me to dismiss career officials responsible for vaccine policy without cause. He said if I was unwilling to do both, I should resign. I responded that I could not pre-approve recommendations without reviewing the evidence, and I had no basis to fire scientific experts. He told me he had already spoken with the White House several times about having me removed. On August 25th, I could have stayed silent, agreed to the demands, and no one would have known. What the public would have seen were scientists dismissed without cause and vaccine protections quietly eroded, all under the authority of a Senate-confirmed director with unimpeachable credentials. I could have kept the office, the title, but I would have lost the one thing that cannot be replaced, my integrity.
After Menares gave her remarks, Dr. Oury chimed in.
I resigned because CDC leaders were reduced to rubber stamps, supporting policies not based in science and putting American lives at risk. Secretary Kennedy censored CDC science, politicized its processes, and stripped leaders of independence. I could not, in good conscience, remain under those conditions. Trust and transparency have been broken. Here again, the problem is not too much science, but too little. I first learned that the Secretary had changed our CDC COVID vaccine guidance on an ex-social media post. CDC scientists have still not seen the scientific data or justification for this change. That is not gold standard science. The Secretary's office ordered the removal from our website of the CDC scientific document on thimerosal, an additive to vaccines that science has shown is not linked to autism, while allowing an unvetted presentation on thimerosal to happen at ACIP, containing scientific assertions that were not assessed for data quality and bias. That kind of last-minute alteration undermines confidence in the deliberations that follow and is certainly not radical transparency.
The September 17 hearing was significant for transparency and public understanding, but it produced zero formal consequences. There were no disciplinary measures for Kennedy, Menares was not reinstated, and it did not lead to any change in policy. Whether you side with Kennedy or you side with Menares, both internally and externally, it is a bad look for the American healthcare system. When both sides hurl accusations that the other is corrupt and lying, it reduces the public trust. No amount of so-called radical transparency hearings can change that fact. I personally believe that Kennedy is well-intentioned. However, without formal medical training, he struggles to appropriately evaluate healthcare research and draw suitable conclusions from it. I do not view him as a charlatan deliberately misleading others for his own gain. I genuinely think he believes what he says. Some of his stated goals are admirable, but they are not well thought through. Distancing ACIP members from a profiteering pharmaceutical industry makes sense to uphold impartiality and protect public interest. However, overlooking that pre-existing panel members were required to undergo vetting for conflicts of interest and disclose their status, then firing all of them to replace them with others who could hardly be thought of as free from their own biases, strikes me as hypocritical. Similarly, trying to protect people from the harms of mercury is admirable. However, when the vast majority of the scientific community is saying that a specific variant is not associated with any adverse effects, then at some point it becomes wise to listen. Overall, the course of the events that transpired highlight the fall from grace of the American healthcare policy and leave the future increasingly uncertain. If trends continue, then the American health policy environment may be increasingly politicized, which I anticipate will only come at a detriment to the everyday American. Now, just a few final thoughts to close this section out and bring us up to the present. There have been additional calls for Kennedy's resignation, and the ACIP process continues to be undermined. I'd like to turn our attention to a presidential memorandum issued by Donald Trump on December 5th, 2025. In it, Trump directed Kennedy and his staff to review best practices from peer-developed countries for core childhood vaccination recommendations, i.e. vaccines recommended for all children, and the scientific evidence that informs those best practices, and if they determine that those best practices are superior to current domestic recommendations, update the United States core childhood vaccine schedule to align with such scientific evidence and best practices from peer-developed countries while preserving access to vaccines currently available to Americans. I suppose Trump was looking to save money, at least in the short term, and thought that he could do so by reducing the number of recommended vaccines that would be covered. Benchmarking against other countries was a way of selling this to the public. Reducing vaccination can lower upfront costs, but downstream costs can come through increased disease burden. Striking the correct balance usually requires a careful assessment of data through a special type of research called Health Economics Outcome Research, or HEOR. FactCheck.org has reported that in signing a January 5th memo, CDC Acting Director Jim O'Neill eliminated routine childhood recommendations for vaccines against 4 diseases: rotavirus, hepatitis A, meningococcal disease, and influenza. This meant that the CDC now recommended vaccination against 11 childhood diseases, down from 17 when Trump came to office. The January 5 memo bypassed the CDC's Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices. To justify the recent changes, HHS officials instead cited a 33-page assessment prepared by 2 political appointees, Dr. Tracy Beth Hogue, who was acting director of the Food and Drug Administration's Drug Division, and Martin Koldorf, a biostatistician and epidemiologist who had previously served as chair of ACIP for Kennedy after he dismissed the previous ACIP members. O'Neill was chosen for his CDC role after Menars was fired following clashes with Kennedy over the vaccine schedule. Dr. Paul Offit, a pediatrician and vaccine expert at Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, said, "You basically have a group of federal appointees going behind closed doors and making recommendations about a vaccine without any input from the public, without any input from experts in the field, and just making up their own schedule."